Hello and welcome. Happy New Year. It has been a few months since I last posted one of these videos, and it's definitely time to do another one. Well, what can I say? The last few months have been quite interesting. The most important theme of the last few months has been the politicization of natural gas. Who would have thought that natural gas, the fuel that has been demonized over the last couple of years, is suddenly becoming the heart of a lot of geopolitical tensions? Of course, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the Ukraine, very much related to natural gas and energy security, potentially what's going to happen in other parts of the world as well, especially what we see in China. So I think it is time to have another bit of a chat about what's going on in the world and how natural gas may or may not be the answer to a lot of the problems that we're having. Well, in the end of the day, I think that no one can dispute that natural gas is a very important fuel, and it is now driving foreign policy. When we have things like the US president encouraging more natural gas to be produced, we have the US government asking places like Qatar and Australia to back up European natural gas if there's a problem. We, of course, have the whole issue of Nord Stream 2, what a debacle that's been since the very, very beginning. And, with these crazy prices that we're seeing everywhere. So let's try to break down some of these themes and try to understand maybe what's going on. I think what has shown me is the importance of the diversity of supply. Countries, buyers, firms, entities, etc., that have a diversity, a portfolio of supply choices are much more better able to manage any disruptions, any political issues, any kind of a supply chain issues, etc., etc. So having a diversity is very, very important. And we can see that part of what's going on in Europe right now is that the Russians have increased their control of the European market. I think it's up to 40% overall, but it could be even higher in some countries. And that gives them a lot of leverage. And of course, places like the Ukraine, which are pretty much 90% dependent on Russian gas passing through, etc., this makes a massive difference to them as well. So we need to really keep on stressing the diversity of supply. Diversity is absolutely the key. What this also has shown us is the importance of flexibility. There's this interesting story that's been going around of a ship that was loaded in the US Gulf Coast, went through the Panama Canal heading to North Asia somewhere, made a U-turn in the Pacific, went back through the canal, and actually ended up discharging in the UK. This was just a few weeks ago. I think what that does show is the fact that now we're seeing a commoditization of LNG. LNG will be diverted, will be going to where the prices are the highest. If you didn't have that flexibility in your contract, you probably wouldn't be able to do that. So the buyers that did that probably had a very flexible, typical US contract without any destination restrictions, and they could divert the ship. Though it didn't seem logical right now, looking at it, it probably made a lot of economic sense for them to turn the ship and cross the Panama Canal twice on the way to their final destination. So the flexibility is really important. We live in very volatile times. We have seen how Asian prices have gone from lower than Europe to higher than Europe, and now again lower than Europe, and that really changes where the LNG flows happen to be. And these flows can only be done when there's flexibility. If the buyers have bought from your typical traditional sellers, such as the Middle Eastern Qataris, or even a lot of the Australian contracts, you have no diversity or flexibility. You have no flexibility. You have to take the gas. If you buy from the US and some of the trading companies, you may have more flexibility. So that importance to really maintain that flexibility, the importance of flexibility has been demonstrated over the last few months. I think another really interesting point that's come up is about we really want to separate as much as we possibly can, and I realize we cannot always separate that much, the control of governments versus the commercial flows of natural gas. When you buy from private companies, buyers make a contract with private companies, such as all the companies in the US, such as many of the companies in Australia, etc. There is a private to private relationship. When you buy from a state-owned enterprise, Gazprom for a lot of the Europeans, or from Qatar, or even from Indonesia, there's always a chance that politics might come into your commercial arrangement. remember, you're signing 20, 25-year arrangements. This is a long time. Political winds do change. And we've seen the importance of trying to separate that commercial relationship from the government policy at the time. And you can see that governments increasingly around the world are able to use natural gas as political weapons. Now, we saw that in the oil business for many, many years. OPEC, in the end of the day, is a government organization that controls private oil markets. Most of that oil, all the oil that OPEC controls, of course, is from the state. And they had a lot of control over the national oil companies that they control how and when and how much and what price to sell that oil to. Natural gas has been relatively apolitical till now. Now we see how natural gas is also becoming quite the weapon. In the past, it was only really used by the Russians in pipeline transits through Europe as a political weapon. Now we're seeing that more and more as a weapon, as a political weapon. So I think that this also shows that, the importance of trying to keep the government entities out of that commercial relationships. The more a private buyer buys from a state-owned enterprise, the more risk it has during the life of that contract that some political relationships might change between their country and another country or something else, and suddenly their contract, their supply is in jeopardy. And the Russians are obviously the kings of this. We have seen the Qataris over the years being quite good about maintaining their commercial relationships. But who knows? I mean, these things can change over time as well. So that is another word of warning that, when you get into a commercial relationship with a state-owned enterprise on the other side, you are taking that political risk. I think that, obviously I'm very biased, but what the differentiation of the U.S. comes in loud and clear. The U.S. has a lot of capacity. U.S. has private enterprises. U.S. has an ability to supply all over the world. The government in the U.S., though I must say has a bit of control, doesn't have a lot of control over the prices, the commercial arrangements, etc. And really can do, apart from, sanctioned countries that we cannot trade with, it really doesn't come into our commercial relationships, which is probably the right thing. What I do think is, putting the U.S., favorable things aside, the U.S. is becoming the global swing producer of LNG. It's really the only place in the world that has potentially a lot of capacity. It has growing capacity. It has the ability to sell to different markets. It has the ability to sell in flexible contracts. A bit like, for decades, Saudi was the swing producer in OPEC because they had that spare capacity. I'm not saying the U.S. has spare capacity. The U.S. has the ability to add capacity, probably non-government control capacity better than anywhere else in the world. So that's something to think about and watch as the U.S. becomes more of that global swing producer that we had, the role that Saudi played in the oil markets. But let's just talk about LNG markets now in specific ways. LNG demand is just going higher and higher. Though there's been so much talk about the demise of gas and the demise of gas as being this important, this fuel that's on its way out and we shouldn't invest in it and blah, 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 blah. Last year, 2021, was a record year in LNG production, LNG trade. This year, it will go up again. May not be as high a dramatic increase as last year, but the point is that the world is really not at a stage to give up natural gas. In fact, I think that we have seen how the importance of natural gas, and any calls to limit the investment in natural gas, to limit the financing of natural gas, etc., are really quite naive. In my continued to be very strong views, natural gas is the ideal transition fuel for low carbon. It is really the only choice we have. We have seen years of quite a large investment in renewable non-fossil fuel energy, but yet it still makes up an incredibly small proportion of global energy demand, especially in the developing world. I think we have to keep in mind that in the developing world, they still need basic energy, basic fuel, and natural gas is probably the best way to do it. And you can see that countries such as India aggressively increasing their city gas grid. That makes so much sense, and that's exactly what we need to do. The best thing we can do to improve the air in many cities in India is to remove all other dirty fuels, and that includes, of course, cooking fuels such as the biofuels and all this other very low-tech fuels, as well as for transportation. India is a leader in gas for transportation as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to be careful about calling the end of LNG, calling the end of natural gas, when that is really still the transition fuel. We have seen, and I remain an incredible skeptic on things like hydrogen, especially liquid hydrogen, moving a gas that's minus 253 degrees C when LNG is only minus 160, when there's hardly a ship that can do this. I live in Australia, and just seeing the media frenzy over that liquid hydrogen cargo was just too much. I mean, in the end of the day, that ship was moving 80% of its cargo was hydrogen that came from Japan to Australia. They only loaded up to 20% of its capacity to move back to Japan. The ship was fueled not on hydrogen, it was fueled on diesel. The hydrogen came from the dirtiest coal around. There was no carbon capture, there was no carbon storage. The whole thing was just a show. Yes, it was a good technical experiment, but let's call it what it is. It was a technical experiment to show that you can move hydrogen around. It's the only ship in the world that can move even a small quantity. The quantity, especially the energy quantity that was moved, was minuscule compared to LNG tankers. There's 400 to 500 LNG tankers in the world. This was the one liquid hydrogen ship. It's a good step, but my God, this is not changing the energy mix. This is not going to be the panacea to solve all the problems that we have. So let's be completely clear. I think hydrogen has a long way to go. Blue hydrogen, to me, which is, as far as I can understand, purely hydrogen produced from renewable energy. Well, if you have that renewable clean energy, just use it in the first place. Why do you want to destroy energy and go through electrolysis and make hydrogen? And you can't even store hydrogen that easily. You can't move it that easily. You're better off just using electricity, getting batteries, whatever you need to do, but use that electricity instead of breaking down and losing energy along the way. All this hype about, converting, the carbon storage. Sorry, I may have got the blues and the greens hydrogen wrong, but you know what I'm trying to say. But you're taking hydrogen produced from fossil fuels and then carbon capture and storage. I'm a geophysicist. I've been looking at carbon storage, for many decades. The company I used to work for, Arco, used to run the largest carbon miscible water flood system in the world, in the Permian, in the US. Carbon storage is not easy. It is not something that can be applicable everywhere. Yes, of course, we should look at it, but let's be realistic. Around in the US, I think at some point there were 300 carbon projects that were proposed 20 years ago. How many of them are operating today? Maybe half a dozen, if less. How many are being proposed all around the world? Like, people are making it sound like it's so easy to remove the carbon from the flue gas coming out of a smokestack and then shoving that carbon right in the ground right there. I just find it ridiculous. In places like Australia and Victoria, where I live, you can't drill a well, a water well, a hydro. You can't drill an oil and gas well, but you're going to suddenly drill wells to secure and store carbon. Like it's that easy to do. I guess what I'm trying to say is just look at the experience of Chevron Gorgon. I think they spent about $3 billion, if not more, on their carbon project itself. And for all accounts, it doesn't work. It's still a failure. Yeah, maybe coming of its own now, but it's still a long way to go. So I think that we cannot kid ourselves that this is going to solve all the problems. So let's be realistic. We still need to support natural gas. We still need to obviously invest and R&D and all these other fuels, but that doesn't mean to cut off natural gas at its knees and not support that. So let's talk about markets just quickly to wrap things up. Supply is going to be tight. Supply is going to be tight all year. We don't see a lot of new supply coming from anywhere. The US is probably the only place we're going to see some new real supply, incremental supply in 2022. Even that may not be as high as we would like. There haven't been a lot of FIDs 5 years ago, final investment decisions 5 years ago. When you don't have projects 5 years ago, you don't have supply today. It's simple as that. Really around the world, we continue to see operational issues. The big boys are not immune to this at all. Shell Prelude is an absolute unmitigated disaster. Shell has been incredibly secretive about that project since the day it was conceptualized. I think this really shows that if you're trying to be secret, you have the hubris to think that you're the only ones that can do anything right without sharing any information, anything at all. Maybe if you had the input of other companies, other people, other experts, you would not be in that situation today. As far as I can see, Prelude, the best thing that can happen to Prelude is the big cyclone comes along. But in the end of the day, $15-20 billion have been spent by Shell. As far as I can see, no one's got fired for it. No one really got responsible for it, and it'll never actually produce amount of LNG. I've been a skeptic of Prelude for a long, long time. If you look at the cost per ton, it's 10-20 times any other project. And I think it just goes to show, just because there's a big name behind it doesn't mean that these projects are going to work without fail. Anyway, I don't want to get on any one project, but the point I think is that we have a supply issue coming up. There's going to be tight supply around the world. Yes, of course, the Qataris are expanding. The Russians will expand. We'll see how much support they get as their political situation increases, particularly heat. But in the end of the day, we're not seeing a lot of new supply. We have seen no new FIDs in the U.S. for a couple of years now. It's time to get some FIDs in the U.S. We at Texas LNG, of course, this video is not on behalf of Texas LNG, but we need to look at getting long-term contracts. If you're a buyer, talk to me about Texas LNG supply. Of course, I'm always happy to talk about that. But in the end of the day, we're not seeing enough. It was good to see the Chinese come back into the U.S. market and sign a few long-term deals towards the end of last year. That's good, but we're still not seeing enough deals supporting greenfield projects. So we need to do that. Otherwise, we're going to be in a tight supply situation for a long, long time. Demand continues to rise around the world. China, of course, is going to get some good supply from the Russians pipeline, but China demand is increasing. India demand is going to skyrocket over the next few years. Latin American, we can't control the hydro, of course, and it looks like Latin America is going to continue lots of LNG. And we know the problems in Europe. Yeah, it is good to see that Groningen might have a bit more production left in it than we think it does. But in the end of the day, this whole experience has shown that Europe cannot depend on 40-50% of its gas from Russia. It's dangerous. It's obviously Russians have no qualms about using that as weapons. And it's quite ironic that on one hand, the Europeans fund the Russian treasury by buying Russian gas. And then in the end, Russians buy arms and troops. And now the Europeans are funding, through NATO, etc., weapons to fight against any of those troops as well. So it seems like not buying as much Russian gas may have been the answer in the first place. I expect prices to stay high. I expect volatility to stay to prices are not going to be as high as they were last year. I mean, the $40 JKM price was ridiculous. I think we're going to see, $10, $15 to $20 JKM and TTF. That's still incredibly high, but it's possible. What that does show is how, of all the price formulas out there, the U.S. Henry Hub or U.S. index price was actually the best price for last year. If you had an oil link price, you saw oil prices go up. Oil prices will continue to go up, so you're not going to get a great deal. If you're exposed to the spot market, well, you're obviously not doing very well. It makes no sense to me that you as a buyer should sign long-term deals linked to the spot market, because in the end, that's not a diversification away from your exposure to the spot market. You can always buy in the spot market. Shouldn't you buy long-term on a price index that's not related to that spot market? To me, that gives you that diversification. Back to what I said earlier, diversification is absolutely the theme here. You need to have diversification and flexibility to manage all these global, political, commercial upheavals that we will continue to see. So, in the end of the day, I think the U.S. gas prices will come back to vogue. People are going to want more U.S. Henry Hub exposure, if nothing else, just to fit in their mix. And I think from the geopolitical point of view, you really don't want to be buying too much gas from state-owned enterprises. It's going to be a wild ride this year. It should be exciting. I look forward to comments. Thank you very much.